June 20, 2024, the day Venezuela redrew the map. Let me tell you something most people missed. On that sweltering afternoon in Caracas, when Nicolas Maduro stood before a crowd of redshirt supporters and declared that Venezuela was annexing two-thirds of neighboring Guyana, an area larger than England, rich with oil and gold, it wasn't just another Latin American power play. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that could reshape the global order. And if you think this is just about a border dispute, you're missing the point entirely. I've spent the last 30 years studying how small, seemingly isolated conflicts spiral into global crises. I was in the room when the Soviet Union collapsed, when NATO exited eastward, when China began its quiet rise. And what I'm seeing now isn't random. It's a calculated move in a much larger game, one where Venezuela isn't just acting on its own, but as a proxy in a contest that stretches from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. The question isn't if this will escalate, but how far and who else gets pulled in. But before we get to that, let's start with what you've been told. The official simple border dispute gone wrong. Here's the story the media has been feeding. Venezuela, a country in economic freefall, is lashing out at Guyana over the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory that's been disputed for over a century. The trigger? Guyana's recent oil discoveries. ExxonMobil alone has found reserves worth over $150 billion. Maduro, facing an election in July and approval ratings in the low 20s, needed a distraction. So he held a referendum in December 2023, where Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to reclaim Essequibo. Then, in April, he announced the creation of a new Venezuelan state, Guayana Esequiba, and sent troops to the border. The U.S. responded with military exercises alongside Guyana, the UK dispatched a warship, and the UN called for calm. The official line is that this is a local conflict, a desperate strongman's attempt to rally nationalist sentiment. The White House has framed it as a test of the rules-based order, with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declaring, "The United States stands with Guyana in defense of its sovereignty." The New York Times ran an editorial calling Maduro's move a naked land grab, while The Economist warned of another flashpoint in a world already on edge. Even the OAS, not exactly a bastion of pro-Venezuelan sentiment, condemned the annexation as a violation of international law. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. If this were just about Maduro's domestic troubles, why did China and Russia immediately back Venezuela's claim? Why did Iran's foreign minister visit Caracas days before the annexation announcement? And why, just 2 weeks after Maduro's speech, did Russia begin moving nuclear-capable bombers to Cuba for the first time since the Cold War? This wasn't random. Venezuela didn't act alone. And if we don't understand the forces behind this move, we're going to sleepwalk into a crisis we're not prepared for. Deconstructing the hidden: what's really happening. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1, the oil isn't the only prize, it's the leverage. Yes, Essequibo is oil-rich. But here's what no one is talking: Guyana's offshore fields are exactly where Exxon, Chevron, and Shell have staked their future. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that Guyana's reserves could make it the world's fourth-largest offshore oil producer by 2030. That's a direct threat to OPEC, where Venezuela is a founding member and where Saudi Arabia and Russia have been trying to keep prices high by cutting production. Now, imagine if Venezuela, with Russian and Chinese backing, could control that supply. Suddenly, you have a cartel within a cartel. The U.S. would lose its grip on global energy markets, and the petrodollar, already under pressure from de-dollarization, would take another hit. This isn't just about Maduro's ego. It's about who controls the flow of oil in the 21st century. Fact number 2, the referendum was a sham, but the military buildup isn't. The December 2023 referendum was a farce. Independent observers reported voter intimidation, and the opposition boycotted it. But here's the military mobilization that followed wasn't performative. Satellite imagery shows Venezuela has moved S-300 air defense systems, Russian-made, capable of shooting down U.S. jets, to the border. They've deployed Su-30 fighter jets, also Russian, and have begun constructing new airstrips in Essequibo. This isn't just posturing. It's preparation for a prolonged conflict. And who's supplying these weapons? Russia. Who's providing intelligence support? Iran. Who's offering economic lifelines? China. This isn't a lone wolf operation. It's a coalition of the willing, but not the one you're used to hearing about. Fact number 3, the US was warned and ignored it. Here's where it gets really interesting. In early 2023, US intelligence picked up chatter between Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing about a potential move on Essequibo. The CIA even briefed the White House, warning that Maduro was testing US resolve. But the Biden administration was focused on Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. Latin America? It was an afterthought. Then, in November, just weeks before the referendum, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Venezuela. The official readout mentioned strengthening bilateral ties. The real conversation? A quiet "if you move on Essequibo, we'll back you." China followed up with a $5 billion credit line to Venezuela, earmarked for infrastructure development, code for military support. The US had months to deter this. It didn't. And now we're playing catch-up. Fact number 4, this isn't just about Guyana, it's about the Monroe Doctrine's death. For 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine has been the cornerstone of US policy in the Western "no foreign powers in our backyard." But in the last decade, Russia and China have systematically eroded it. Russia has a military base in Nicaragua. China has built ports in AMA and El Salvador. And now, with Venezuela's move on Essequibo, we're seeing the first direct challenge to US hegemony in the region since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message is the US can't enforce its will in its own neighborhood anymore. And if you think that doesn't have global implications, you're not paying attention. The broader geopolitical why this matters to everyone. Let's out. This isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the three-way struggle between the US, China, and Russia for global dominance. And right now, the US is losing. The US, a superpower stretched thin. America is fighting a 3-front war: Ukraine, Taiwan, and now Latin America, with a defense budget that's already strained. The US has 750 military bases in 80 countries, but its ability to project power is diminishing. In Ukraine, we're running out of artillery shells. In the Pacific, China is outbuilding us in shipyards. And in Latin America, we're relying on sanctions that haven't worked in decades. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela has been more of the same. Sanctions, military exercises, diplomatic condemnations. But here's the: sanctions don't work when your adversaries have alternative financial systems. China and Russia have been trading with Venezuela in yuan and rubles for years. The US can freeze Venezuelan assets in New York, but it can't stop Beijing from wiring money to Caracas through its digital currency. And let's be, the US doesn't have the stomach for another war. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the American public is war-weary. The Pentagon knows this. That's why they're relying on Guyana to do the fighting, arming them, training them, but not committing US troops. It's a gamble. Because if Guyana falls, the US will have to intervene and risk a wider war, or back down and lose credibility. The quiet puppeteer. China isn't sending troops to Venezuela. It doesn't need to. It's playing the long game. By backing Maduro, Beijing gets 3. 1. A foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Essequibo's oil and gold are valuable, but the real prize is influence. If Venezuela controls the region, China gets first dibs on its resources. 2. A test of US resolve. If the US doesn't push back hard, China will see it as a green light to move on Taiwan. 3. A distraction. The more the US is focused on Latin America, the less it can focus on the South China Sea. China's strategy is asymmetric. It doesn't need to win a war. It just needs to make sure the US loses. The spoiler. Russia is the wild card. It's not as economically powerful as China, but it's more willing to take risks. By backing Venezuela, Moscow. 1. A way to bleed the US. Every dollar the US spends in Latin America is a dollar it can't spend in Ukraine. 2. A bargaining chip. If the US pushes too hard, Russia can escalate elsewhere. 3. A propaganda win. The more the US looks weak, the more Russia can sell the narrative that the West is in decline. Putin has been he wants a multipolar world. And if that means turning Venezuela into a proxy war, he's all in. The Cuban Missile Crisis, but worse. In 1962, the US and USSR came to the brink of nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. The crisis was resolved because both sides had clear red lines and backchannels. Today? We don't have that. Back then, the US had overwhelming military superiority. Today, Russia has hypersonic missiles that can hit the US in 30 minutes. Back then, China was a poor, agrarian country. Today, it's the world's second largest economy. Back then, Latin America was firmly in the US sphere. Today, it's a battleground. The difference? In 1962, the US and USSR were rational actors. Today, we have Maduro, a leader who's cornered, desperate, and backed by two nuclear powers. That's a dangerous combination. Military, what happens if this escalates? Let's talk about the military dimension. Because if this goes hot, it won't be a quick, clean war. It'll be a mess. Venezuela's stronger than you think. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1990s, but it's still formidable. It's Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. These can shoot down US stealth aircraft. Su-30 fighter jets capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Iranian drones used in attacks on Saudi Arabia, now in Venezuela's arsenal. A million-strong militia poorly trained, but enough to tie down US forces in urban warfare. The US could overwhelm Venezuela in a conventional war. But here's the Venezuela doesn't need to win. It just needs to make the cost of intervention too high. Guyana's a David without a sling. Guyana has a tiny military, just 3,000 active duty troops. It's buying drones and missiles from India, but it's years away from having a real defense. The US and UK are sending warships and conducting joint exercises, but that's not enough. If Venezuela invades, Guyana falls in days. The real question: will the US intervene directly? And the answer: probably not. Because the moment US troops set foot in Essequibo, we're in a shooting war with Venezuela and by extension, Russia and China. The escalation, how this could spin out of control. Here's how this could go. 1. Phase 1, proxy war. The US arms Guyana, Russia and Iran arm Venezuela. Low-intensity conflict, but no direct US involvement. 2. Phase 2, limited strikes. If Venezuela attacks US assets, the US responds with airstrikes. Russia and China condemn it, but don't intervene. 3. Phase 3, direct confrontation. If US strikes hit Russian or Iranian advisors in Venezuela, Moscow and Tehran retaliate. Maybe a cyber attack on US infrastructure, or a proxy attack in the Middle East. 4. Phase 4, global crisis. If Russia moves nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, the US has to. Do we risk a nuclear standoff over Guyana? This isn't hypothetical. This is how wars start. The lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Remember when the US thought it could liberate Iraq in weeks? Or when we thought Afghanistan would be a quick nation-building project? Or when we thought toppling Gaddafi would bring democracy to Libya? Here's the hard: the US has a terrible track record at predicting how wars will unfold. And in Venezuela, we're not just dealing with a weak military. We're dealing with a country that's allied with two nuclear powers and has nothing to lose. The domestic political why: this is about more than foreign policy. Now, let's talk about what's really driving US politics. Election year calculus. It's 2024. Biden is running for re-election, and his approval ratings are underwater. The last thing he needs is another foreign policy crisis. But here's the: if he does nothing, he looks weak. If he intervenes, he risks a quagmire. So what's the play? Symbolic toughness. Military exercises, sanctions, diplomatic condemnations, but no boots on the ground. It's the same strategy Obama used in look tough, but don't actually fight. The swing state factor. Florida has 30 electoral votes. It's home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They hate him. and they vote. If Biden looks soft on Venezuela, he loses Florida, and with it, the election. That's why you're seeing Republicans like Marco Rubio and Rick Scott pushing for harsher action. They're not just thinking about foreign policy. They're thinking about November. The blob's influence. The foreign policy establishment, the so-called blob, is pushing for intervention. Think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council are publishing papers on restoring U.S. credibility in Latin America. Defense contractors are lobbying for more arms sales to Guyana. But here's the blob has been wrong about almost every major foreign policy decision of the last 20 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Ukraine. And now they want to double down on the same failed strategies. Scenario how this could play out. Let's game this out. Here are the 3 most likely scenarios, ranked by probability. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. Venezuela annexes Essequibo, but stops short of a full-scale invasion. The U.S. imposes sanctions, but China and Russia keep Venezuela afloat. Guyana sues Venezuela in the ICJ, but the case drags on for years. The status quo holds, but the region remains unstable. Why this is no one wants a war. The US doesn't want to fight, Venezuela can't afford to, and China/Russia prefer a slow bleed. Why it sets a precedent. If Venezuela gets away with this, other countries will try the same. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and the US looks weak. Scenario 2, the proxy war. Venezuela invades Guyana, but stops at the Essequibo River. The US arms Guyana, Russia, and Iran arm Venezuela. A low-intensity conflict drags on for years, with occasional flare-ups. The US avoids direct intervention, but the region becomes a battleground for great power competition. Why this is it's the path of least resistance. The US can claim it's supporting democracy without committing troops. Russia and China can claim they're resisting US imperialism without risking a direct war. Why it turns Latin America into another Ukraine, a forever war with no clear winner. And it distracts the US from more pressing threats. Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. Venezuela attacks a US asset. The US retaliates with airstrikes. Russia moves nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. The US imposes a naval blockade. China threatens to cut off rare earth exports. Before you know it, we're in a global crisis. Why this is because miscalculation is the most common cause of war. Maduro is desperate. Putin is unpredictable. And Biden is under pressure to do something. Why it's this is how World War III starts. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Let's take a step back. Why is the US in this mess? Because we've been pursuing a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. It hasn't worked. The pattern of failure. Iraq. Iraq wasn't just a war, it was a masterclass in how liberal hegemony backfires. We spent $2 trillion, lost 4,500 American lives, and turned a secular dictatorship into a failed state that became the world's largest jihadist training ground. And what did we get in return? A Shia-led government in Baghdad that now cozies up to Tehran, Iranian-backed militias controlling swaths of the country, and a Kurdish region that's more economically tied to Turkey than to Washington. The irony? We toppled Saddam to weaken Iran, and ended up handing them their greatest strategic victory in centuries. Now, what most people don't realize is that this wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of a foreign policy that confuses military power with actual influence. The US can drop more bombs than any country in history, but that doesn't mean we can reshape societies in our image. Afghanistan proved it. Libya proved it. And now, Venezuela is proving it again. Let me explain why this matters beyond just Latin America. The Essequibo crisis isn't just about a disputed border, it's about the death of American deterrence. For decades, the US relied on the Monroe Doctrine as a kind of geopolitical force field. The message was mess with the Western Hemisphere, and you'll pay a price. But what happens when that force field flickers out? Here's the uncomfortable: the US hasn't enforced the Monroe Doctrine in any meaningful way since the Cold War. The last time we even came close was in 1989, when Bush Sr. invaded AMA to remove Noriega. Since then? Nothing. We've watched Venezuela collapse into a narco-state, Cuba remain a Soviet relic, and Nicaragua slide back into dictatorship, all without so much as a serious pushback. And now, with Maduro testing the waters in Guyana, we're seeing the logical endpoint of that in action. The military implications are even more worrying. If Venezuela does launch a limited invasion, say, seizing a few oil fields in Essequibo, the US has exactly three bad options. Option: do nothing, and watch our credibility evaporate. Option: arm Guyana and turn the region into a proxy war zone, which is exactly what Russia and Iran want. Option: strike Venezuelan targets, which risks escalation with Moscow and Beijing. Now, you might be surely the US wouldn't let things get that far. But that's the problem, we've already let things get this far. The Pentagon has been warning about Venezuela's military buildup for years. In 2020, the U.S. Southern Command reported that Russia had deployed long-range bombers to Venezuela, including nuclear-capable Tu-160s. In 2021, Iran sent military advisors to help Maduro's regime evade sanctions. And in 2023, China quietly exited its intelligence-gathering facilities in Cuba, just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Here's what keeps me up: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new rules of the game. For the first time since the 19th century, the US is facing a multipolar challenge in its own backyard. Russia is back in Cuba. China is building ports in the Caribbean. Iran is smuggling drones and missiles to Venezuela. And the US? We're still pretending this is 1999. Let's talk about the military balance for a second. Venezuela's armed forces are a shadow of what they were in the 1980s, but they're not irrelevant. They've got Russian Su-30 fighter jets, Iranian-made drones, and Chinese anti-ship missiles. More importantly, they've got something the US doesn't: the element of surprise. If Maduro decides to move on Essequibo, he won't announce it on CNN. He'll do it fast, before the US can react. The US response would likely start with sanctions again. But sanctions haven't worked in Venezuela for the same reason they haven't worked in Iran, or because authoritarian regimes don't care about their people's suffering. The next step would be military aid to Guyana, but Guyana's army is tiny, just 3,000 active duty troops. The US could send special forces, but that's a slippery slope. Once American boots are on the ground, even in small numbers, the pressure to escalate becomes enormous. And that's when things get dangerous. Because if the US does strike Venezuelan targets, say, a radar station or an airstrip, Russia and China won't sit idly by. Moscow has already warned that any US intervention in Venezuela would be met with a proportional response. That could mean anything from cyber attacks to sending more nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas. China, meanwhile, could retaliate economically, cutting off rare earth exports, for example, which would cripple US defense production. Here's the: none of this is happening in a vacuum. The US is already stretched thin. We've got a war in Ukraine, a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, and a Middle East on the brink of explosion. Adding a Venezuela crisis to the mix isn't just risky, it's strategically reckless. So why is this happening? Because the US foreign policy establishment still hasn't learned the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. We keep thinking that if we just apply enough pressure, sanctions, military aid, diplomatic isolation, we can bend other countries to our will. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. Authoritarian regimes like Venezuela, Russia, and Iran don't play by our rules. They play by theirs. And their rules are escalate until the US backs down. That's what happened in Syria. That's what happened in Ukraine. And that's what's happening now in Guyana. The real question isn't whether the US can win a war with Venezuela. It's whether we can afford to keep losing the peace. Because every time we let a rogue regime get away with aggression, we send a message to the rest of the US is a paper tiger. And that's a message that will come back to haunt us. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about oil or territory, it's about the survival of Maduro's regime. Let me explain why this matters for Venezuela's domestic politics. The referendum on Essequibo wasn't some spontaneous nationalist outburst. It was a calculated move by a government that's been teetering on the edge of collapse for years. Remember 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing? That moment exposed the regime's fragility. The military didn't fracture, but the cracks were visible. Maduro's approval ratings have hovered around 15% for years, and the economy is a smoking ruin. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has destroyed the bolivar, and over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's nearly a quarter of the population. So why is Maduro picking a fight with Guyana now? Because he needs a crisis to distract from the fact that his government is running out of options. The U.S. sanctions relief in October 2023, when the Biden administration temporarily eased oil sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions, was a lifeline. But it also exposed Maduro's weakness. The deal was supposed to pave the way for free and fair elections in 2024, but the regime has already backtracked, arresting opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado's campaign staff and banning her from running. The message is Maduro isn't negotiating in good faith. He's buying time. Here's the uncomfortable: the Essequibo gambit is a classic authoritarian playbook move. When your people are starving and your economy is in shambles, you manufacture an external enemy to rally support. It's what Putin did with Crimea in 2014, what Erdogan did with Greece in 2020, and what Xi Jinping is doing with Taiwan today. The difference is that Maduro's regime is far more fragile than any of those. Venezuela's military is corrupt and demoralized, its institutions are hollowed out, and its people are exhausted. A war, even a limited one, could be the spark that finally ignites the powder keg. Let's talk scenarios. The most likely outcome is that Maduro bluffs his way through this, using the threat of conflict to extract concessions from the U.S. and Guyana. He'll demand sanctions relief, recognition of his government, and maybe even a slice of Essequibo's oil revenues in exchange for standing down. The Biden administration, desperate to avoid another crisis, might take the deal. That's what happened in 2023, and it's what's likely to happen again. But here's the: every time the U.S. rewards Maduro for aggression, it emboldens him and other dictators watching from Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The second scenario is escalation. If Guyana calls Maduro's bluff and refuses to negotiate, or if the U.S. decides to draw a red line, things could spiral quickly. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s, but it still has Russian-supplied Su-30 fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and a network of irregular forces, colectivos, paramilitaries, and Cuban advisors that could make any conflict messy. A limited strike on a Venezuelan radar station, as I mentioned earlier, might seem like a proportional response, but it would trigger a cascade of retaliations. Russia could send more Wagner Group mercenaries to Venezuela, China could impose economic costs, and Iran could ramp up its support for Hezbollah in Latin America. The region hasn't seen this level of instability since the Cold War. The third scenario is the most: regime collapse. If Maduro overplays his hand and the military fractures, Venezuela could descend into chaos. The country is already a failed state in all but name. The electricity grid collapses regularly, hospitals lack basic supplies, and the government can't even provide clean water. A coup or a popular uprising could plunge the country into civil war, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that would dwarf the current exodus. The U.S. would be forced to intervene, not to secure oil, but to prevent a mass migration crisis on its southern border. And that's when things get really ugly. Here's why this matters for U.S. policy. The establishment narrative is that Venezuela is a problem to be managed, not solved. Sanctions, diplomacy, and occasional military posturing are the tools of choice. But that approach has failed for 2 decades. The Chavista regime has outlasted 3 U.S. presidents, and it's not going anywhere. The real question is whether the U.S. can accept that reality and adapt, or whether it will keep chasing the same failed strategies. Let me give you an example. In 2002, the Bush administration supported a coup against Hugo Chavez. It backfired spectacularly, strengthening Chavez's grip on power and poisoning U.S.-Venezuela relations for years. In 2019, the Trump administration bet everything on Guaidó, only to watch him to irrelevance. Now, the Biden administration is trying to thread the needle with sanctions relief and half-hearted diplomacy. None of these approaches have worked because they're based on a fundamental: the US keeps treating Venezuela like a problem to be fixed, when in reality, it's a symptom of a larger geopolitical shift. The uncomfortable truth is that the US no longer has the leverage it once did in Latin America. China is now the region's top trading partner, Russia is deepening its military ties, and Iran is extending its influence. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and the US is struggling to adapt. Venezuela is a test case for whether Washington can accept a multipolar world or whether it will keep clinging to the illusion of hegemony. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome is that Maduro will get his way: a temporary reprieve from sanctions, a slice of Essequibo's oil, and a renewed lease on life for his regime. The US will declare victory, the media will move on, and Venezuela will remain a failed state. But the long-term costs will be severe. Every time the US backs down from a rogue regime, it sends a message to the rest of the aggression works. And that's a lesson that will come back to haunt us in Taiwan, Ukraine, and beyond. The real solution isn't more sanctions or military posturing. It's accepting that the US can't control every crisis and focusing instead on strengthening its alliances, rebuilding its economy, and restoring its credibility. But that would require a level of strategic humility that Washington hasn't shown in decades. And until that changes, we'll keep seeing the same provocation, escalation, and retreat. The only question is how many more crises it will take before we learn. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of a grand strategy that Washington has relied on for over a century. The US has long operated under the assumption that it can shape the behavior of smaller states through a mix of economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional covert operation. But that playbook is obsolete, and Venezuela is the clearest proof yet. The problem isn't that Maduro is a master strategist, far from it. The problem is that the US keeps treating geopolitics like a game of chess when it's actually playing Jenga, and every time it pulls a piece out, the whole structure wobbles in ways it didn't anticipate. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions in exchange for Maduro's vague promises of electoral reforms wasn't just a tactical retreat, it was a strategic surrender. And it wasn't even a well-negotiated one. The US gave up leverage without securing concrete concessions, like the release of political prisoners or a clear timeline for free elections. Instead, it got a photo op with a regime that has spent the last decade perfecting the art of survival through repression and external patronage. The message to other authoritarian regimes is: if you can outlast US pressure, Washington will eventually blink. And if you can find a patron like China or Russia to keep you afloat, you can dictate the terms of engagement. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the only game in town, and its adversaries know it. Take the case of Nicaragua. In 2018, Daniel Ortega's regime crushed protests with brutal efficiency, killing hundreds and jailing opposition leaders. The US responded with targeted sanctions, but Ortega didn't flinch. Why? Because by then, he had already secured a $400 million loan from the IMF thanks to Russia's lobbying and deepened ties with China, which has since built a $50 billion canal project. The same pattern is playing out in Cuba, where the US has maintained an embargo for over 6 decades, yet the regime has survived by pivoting to Russia for oil and China for investment. The lesson is: sanctions only work if the target has no alternatives. And in today's world, alternatives are everywhere. The real question is whether the US can adapt. The answer, so far, is not encouraging. Washington's default response to geopolitical challenges is to double down on what's already failed: more sanctions, more military posturing, more moralizing. But the world has changed, and the US hasn't. Consider the case of Iran. For years, the US has tried to isolate Tehran through sanctions, only to watch as Iran deepened its ties with China and Russia. The result? Iran is more entrenched than ever, and the US is left scrambling to contain a crisis of its own making. The same dynamic is playing out in Venezuela, where Maduro has turned to China for oil deals, Russia for military support, and Iran for gasoline shipments. The US keeps treating these relationships as temporary workarounds, but they're not, they're the new normal. So what are the alternatives? The first is to accept that the US can't dictate outcomes in every corner of the globe. That doesn't mean abandoning allies or retreating into isolationism, it means being selective about where and how it engages. The second is to rebuild its economic and diplomatic toolkit. Sanctions are a blunt instrument, and they're losing their edge. The US needs to invest in alternatives, like targeted financial measures that disrupt illicit networks without punishing entire populations. It also needs to revive its diplomatic corps, which has been hollowed out by years of neglect. The State Department's budget is a fraction of what it was during the Cold War, yet the US is facing more complex challenges than ever. The third alternative is to strengthen alliances. The US can't go it alone, and it shouldn't try. But its alliances are fraying, partly because Washington has spent the last 2 decades treating them as transactional relationships rather than partnerships. The EU, for example, has been reluctant to follow the US lead on Venezuela, preferring engagement over confrontation. That's not weakness, it's pragmatism. The US could learn from it. Instead of demanding that allies fall in line, it should work with them to develop common strategies that reflect shared interests, not just American priorities. The fourth alternative is to focus on domestic renewal. The US can't project power abroad if it's crumbling at home. That means investing in infrastructure, education, and technology not just to compete with China, but to restore faith in the American model. The world is watching, and if the US can't get its own house in order, why should anyone else follow its lead? The 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection were wake-up calls, but Washington has hit the snooze button. Until it addresses its internal divisions, its foreign policy will remain reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately ineffective. Now, I know what some will this sounds like defeatism. It's not. It's realism. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but power isn't what it used to be. It's no longer about controlling outcomes, it's about shaping them. And that requires a level of strategic patience and humility that Washington has struggled to muster. The alternative is to keep lurching from crisis to crisis, escalating when it should be engaging, and retreating when it should be standing firm. That's not a strategy, it's a recipe for decline. Venezuela is a microcosm of this larger struggle. The US keeps treating it as a problem to be solved, but it's actually a symptom of a world in transition. The question isn't whether Maduro will survive, it's whether the US can adapt. So far, the signs aren't promising. But history has a way of forcing change, even on those who resist it. The only question is how much damage will be done before Washington finally learns.